This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
I think a lot of people find it rather bewildering. And one of my self-appointed tasks is to try to explain these things that are going on underneath the ground that we're standing on, what the deep changes actually are, why they've come about. And every day's news is filled with the results of this attack on the Western tradition. Sometimes it's another historical figure who we're told is no hero and is actually to be regarded as a villain, literally sometimes pulled down. Just the way I look at the world, I mean, I do try to both be realistic and also laugh where you can. But I also think, I mean, just as a writer, it's very important that books, articles and things don't feel like homework to the reader. I mean, obviously one wants to impart some ideas which are very deep and very, very troubling. But you can't just do that, because otherwise people, apart from anything else, reach for the Prozac. I try to make people laugh where they can. And also at times that's just that what I'm describing hands that to us. I mean, to read them is to do a double take, but to listen to them read out loud, you think, what a sane person could utter such an idiocy. We see that in the modern era. We see it obviously in the case of Israel. Jews were attacked for being rootless cosmopolitans and then were attacked for having a state. They were attacked for being incapable of defending themselves and then were attacked by the world successfully defending themselves. On and on it goes, and on it will always tragically go. But yes, in the current era, I'm very struck by the way in which Jews get caught up in the anti-Westernism of our day, in Israel and in the rest of the West. I think that people have to realize this. They have to have good antennae. It can come from the right as well as the left, and I've myself written about this again recently. There are bits of the right in America, not so much I think in the UK, if at all at the moment, but you always have to keep your eyes open. There are bits of the right in America which play with anti-Semitism in the same ways that parts of the left do. So it can come from any direction. And the Jews very often get caught up in almost anything. The Occupy Wall Street movement goes to anti-Semitism. BLM goes to anti-Semitism. We just have to keep our antennae very alert. Jews and non-Jews, Jews and I don't like philo-Semites because I don't believe in philo-Semitism. They're just friends of Jews, people who are friends of the Jewish people.
Douglas Murray, a warm welcome to Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Very good to be with you, Jonny.
Thank you very much for granting your time. The War on the West is the third book in a series of bestsellers with a very common theme. The thread, I feel, between the strange death of Europe, the madness of crowds, and this book is becoming clearer as you read them all. It's a kind of blindsided attempt to abolish the world that we grew up in.
Yes, I think that's right. It's about a very significant set of changes that have gone on in our lifetime. A transformation of much of the deep substructure of our societies and cultures. Obviously, in the strange death of Europe, I addressed the question of immigration, and which I think is going to be is already and will continue to be one of the great issues of the 21st century. What happens when the developing world wants to move to the developed world? Then in the madness of crowds, I addressed the deep identity politics shifts that are going on, whereby people are encouraged not to identify as belonging to a nation, but to particular minority subsets of gender, race, identity. And this is very much the culmination of those three books, because I think the biggest story going on underneath all of these things is this assault on what was recognizably a Western tradition, a set of values, religious values, philosophical values, cultural values, which in our own day have been assaulted at every single stage, every turn, And I try in the War on the West to explain what it is that has been happening and what it is that people can do to fight back.
It seems to me that those who are unthinking, those who are easygoing people, are being the first to be assaulted. In other words, you have to really be deep into understanding this to take this on. People's assumptions are being flattened, actually, by this attack from all sides.
That's right. That's right. I think a lot of people have found it rather bewildering. And one of my self-appointed tasks is to try to explain these things that are going on underneath the ground that we're standing on, what the deep changes actually are, why they've come about. And every day's news is filled with the results of this attack on the Western tradition. Sometimes it's another historical figure who we're told is no hero and is actually to be regarded as a villain, literally sometimes pulled down. Other days it's aspects of our culture that we're told, is not permissible or is to be regarded in a negative light because it's allegedly stolen, that our culture is all appropriated from other cultures. And these things and much more are going on all of the time. And of course, one of the questions I ask in the book, one of the issues I raise is not just what a strange thing this is for us to be doing to ourselves. And I stress it is mainly us doing it to ourselves. It's Western anti-Westernism that I find most interesting because most destructive. But there is the follow-on question of what's the rest of the world doing whilst we're doing that?
It's a wonderful book, if I might say, Douglas, and it's written with your characteristic humor as well as something which kind of makes one angry, actually. So what is it in your writing that you can write with humor at the same time as actually making you really quite annoyed with what you see around you? Frustration, actually, in people who are your friends, who don't see it as you do in that way.
Yes. Well, I mean, partly that's just the way I look at the world. I mean, I do try to both be realistic and also laugh where you can. But I also think, I mean, just as a writer, it's very important that books, articles and things don't feel like homework to the reader. I mean, obviously one wants to impart some ideas which are very deep and very, very troubling. But you can't just do that because otherwise people, apart from anything else, reach for the Prozac. I try to make people laugh where they can. And also at times that's just that what I'm describing hands that to us. I mean, many of the things I describe, which have become movements in our day, are ludicrous. And by the way, one of the things that's happened with this book and the last book, The Madness of Crowds, is that I've done the audiobook and I've had terrific responses from listeners. And one of the great things about audiobooks is that there are some things on the page that are even funnier, if I say so myself, when read out loud. And that's not because I'm not praising my own jokes or something. It's because the things I'm quoting are so absurd at times and have been made so mainstream. But I mean, to read them is to do a double take, but to listen to them read out loud, you think, what a sane person could utter such an idiocy. So there is some fun to be had along the way, for sure. And I think it's necessary also, just as a writer, the change of pace in a book. You need to keep things mixed up like that, as I say, in order to keep people engaged. I mean, I'm very, very blessed with the size of readership I have and the breadth of my readership, including particularly the young readership that I have. And I think in part that is because I try to make sure that, what I write is informative, is serious, is important, but also as readable as possible.
The clues are out there for those of us who delve into the extreme left Twitter echo chamber. You see the term, and this one actually scares me somewhat because this is what I mean by blindsided. You see this term on the hard left, organize, as though they're taking advantage of a power vacuum. And, this scares me somewhat because if we go back to our ideas of the West being that of borderless freedom, I think perhaps the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an example of our complacency. You know, people do hate us in the West. I mean, Israel and Ukraine is an example of two similar sovereign nations with absolutely massive and more powerful enemies surrounding us. And of course, if Israel didn't defend itself in the way that it did, it would be attempted to be invaded and flattened like Russia is doing to Ukraine.
Yes, I sometimes people have asked me, you know, well, what is the West? And of course, it's sort of inevitable. It comes up, and I don't like getting caught on it, because the problem with definitions is you can get caught on them endlessly. And my shorthand for it is, well, you know it when you see it. You know when you're in Beijing, you're not in the West. You know when you're in Tokyo, you're in an extraordinary place, but you're not in the West. But of course, if you were to have a sort of a not fulsome but as useful as you could shorthand, it would be that the West is a product of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the legacies of ancient Greece and Rome, all refined in the fires of the Enlightenment. And obviously, Israel is a country which, as people know when they're there, is much more like the West than it is, say, the rest of the Arab world, I would argue. Certainly, it's more Western than it is Chinese or Japanese or Asian, or or South American. You know, it's very much a part of the West, and I think that has always been one of the things that, of course, makes some anti-Israel activists sort of try to draw a line of guilt. You know, sort of. In the same way they attack Israel for being capitalist, as if that's a sin, you know, and the interesting thing, of course, is that Israel is a rare country in the West, in that it does buck many of the trends that I describe in the war on the West. I mean, it bucks some of the trends I described in The Strange Death of Europe. I mean, there isn't a fertility rate problem in Israel, for instance, as there is in most European countries. There actually, I would say, although Israel certainly has internal dynamics, which you can see when you're there for long periods of time, nevertheless, I think that in Israel, partly because of the army and people's service in the army, there is a strong feeling of nationhood. There is a strong feeling of national belonging and of the depths that the country needs to call upon in order to unite its people. And so in these ways, you know, Israel is an unusual country in the West in the 21st century, in that, you know, as people have said before, it remembers what you need to do to sustain yourself. And in part in Israel, that's by simple dint of the fact that it's a such threat from its neighbors and always has been. The rest of the West has become lax about that, has not remembered what people behave like in history, what it's like when you exude weakness and internal division and much more. I wondered at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine whether that would be some kind of wake-up call. But as so often, what you hope are going to be wake-up calls so often turn out to be disappointments and business as usual.
Melanie Phillips in my podcast called Israel the Last Man Standing for the very metrics that you talk about, the idea of the fertility rate being 3 children per woman, but not just in the religious community, as you might expect, also the Tel Aviv, the cool, easygoing liberal community as well. Right. So it's an amazing thing. And of course, it isn't just the Jewish population of Israel that feels this brotherhood, this kinship, this statehood. There are many Arab Israelis, in other words, people who identify themselves not as Palestinians, but as non-Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis or Christian Israelis, indigenous people from what is now the modern state of Israel, Christians from Nazareth, from Bethlehem, who served in the IDF, even though they didn't have to, who are part of that. But let's just knock down something in your argument, because it's not the argument that you don't welcome. You are open-minded to all the arguments. It's just the one-sidedness of it. There are so many examples, aren't there? For example, let's pick out Karl Marx as an example, because he was a bit of a racist, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, for those who have, yes, exactly. For those who haven't read the book, I mean, I tried to show the way in which the same remorseless set of allegations are made against basically everybody in the West's history. everybody is guilty of connection with one or all three of the following: racism, slavery, colonialism. And as I show in the book, I mean, this has been done in Britain to great heroes like Winston Churchill. It's been done to great heroes in America, like all of the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, Columbus, of course. And this is common also through looking at our philosophical history. All the philosophers have been attacked, from Aristotle to the Enlightenment. Everyone's attacked for the same set of accusations. But as I do say, it's interesting to see where this is not exercised, where these standards do not get practiced. And the most obvious example, as I say, the biggest example is Karl Marx. As I say, I show in his private and public writings, was a horrible racist, had terrible views on slavery and on colonialism. So why is it the case, not that statues of Karl Marx are pulled down, but they actually still are going up? One went up in his native Germany just a couple of years ago, paid for by the benevolence of the Communist Party of China. So why would this be the case? Well, because, as I try to show, to a great extent, the war on the West is an entirely political war, waged by some very familiar figures. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them are old-fashioned Marxists who want to tear down everything in the Western tradition, claim that everything, including our financial systems, are somehow embedded in racism, and therefore smuggle in the only answer they have left, which is always Marxism, socialism, communism of some kind. So there's a very perceptible double standard, which they say once you see it, it reveals the basically political nature of this exercise. But there are other examples of the same. I mean, in historical terms, our societies are very interested in certain slave trades and totally uninterested in others. I mean, you may say it's simply because, European societies were more involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but the Arab states, the Arab pre-states, Arab societies were slaving at the same time as the Europeans, and indeed bought far more slaves from Africa than the Europeans or the Americans or even the South Americans and Central Americans. This was a long and horrible trade that many, many societies, if not all, at some point were involved in. So why the monomaniacal obsession with just this as one aspect of our own past? Why, when colonialism was something that societies have engaged in, from the beginning, why are we so completely obsessed with some forms of colonialism, only if they're Western? And, understandably, nobody thinks it's a sane or reasonable thing to say, well, one of the biggest empires in history and one of the longest running was the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, all modern day Turkish people should pay some kind of reparations. I mean, it'd be the statement of a madman to insist on that. Yet we do it to our own societies. Again, it's this endless set of double standards. And I reiterate the point you kindly made, which is that I'm not trying to shut any debate down. I find revisionist history can be provocative, interesting, sometimes well-informed, and sometimes a useful corrective. What I mind is the wild political antagonistic nature of the revisionism that's going on at the moment, so that everything to do with colonialism is put in a negative light, so that everything in our history is looked at through the lens of racism. And instead of saying, well, okay, racism has been an aspect of our history as it has been of everybody's history, instead we say that is our history, that racism is the only lens to look at the Western past through. These are deeply unfair standards. They've been practiced for a very long time now, and I think it's time to pull them apart in turn.
And dare I say, the world is coming together in a celebration of slavery, as an example. Now, I'm talking about the Qatar World Cup coming up in the winter.
Yes, absolutely.
Where when the first ball is kicked in anger on the first day of the perverse World Cup, but because it's being kicked off in sort of December as opposed to when it normally is in June, because it's so damn hot in Qatar, it will be sports washed in the most dramatic of fashions of all time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a very interesting point. I make the point in the War in the West that there are estimated to be something like 40 million slaves in the world today. I've actually met people myself on my travels who were born into slavery. 40 million slaves is actually more than were estimated to be around in the 19th century. So none of this is about whataboutery, as some of my critics might like to pretend. It's saying, whilst we're doing this, why do we seem to have no interest in dealing with the issue of slavery, for instance, in the modern world? Why do companies like Apple and Nike grandstand about racism and allegations of racism in modern America and have factories, sweatshops in China? What exactly is going on here with this endless double standard? And the example of that is a kind of whitewashing, the sort of paying of the sort of like a medieval church as a sort of paying of a type of tax in order to excuse your other sins. And this is something going on in our day. I think it's extraordinary that Qatar, which I've been to and I've seen, how do you call it? I mean, the totally bifurcated nature of the society. Why does this get no attention? I mean, the people who are brought in essentially as slave workers from Asia are certainly not treated as equals. They're certainly not allowed to become citizens or have the rights of citizens or anything like it. It's a type of modern day slavery, and it's one you can't really interest people in. So I would be expecting that all the people who, took the knee for months and months on end because they thought that in America the police can just kill black people with impunity, which is an unbelievable lie against America. I would expect those same people to sort of keep very quiet in Qatar. By the way, I've seen that myself, and I mentioned in the book when I spoke in Doha some years ago. I said to my fellow panelists before the debate in front of the Emir's wife and other members of the royal family, I said, I hope you'll agree with me that we can't allow this debate, which was about migration, to go on tonight without mentioning anything about the human rights records for our hosts. And the others said, oh yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. Did anyone else speak up? Nada, zilch, silence. And I was the only one who made myself unpopular with my hosts by pointing to some of these facts. But that's normal. That's totally normal. People go along with modern day atrocities, and by way of satiating their consciences, they talk endlessly about wounds, which in many cases, I would argue, are long since or should be long since closed.
Our Western societies as well are, as you say, they have evolved into a post-racial environment. There is a tolerance, actually, and Brendan O'Neill discussed this with me in my podcast. We think of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, indeed, in this country, of Millwall and Two-Tone. We think in the United States of Motown and the Williams sisters. And I mentioned Millwall and Two-Tone because I am from Birmingham, and I remember in the 80s, Black and White Unite. Two-Tone had the black and white checker, not because it was trendy and looked beautiful, that was one level, but it was the fact that all our bands were black and white because it was a union of the working class. I went to a grammar school on that premise, actually, that you could get yourself what seemed like a public school education from wherever you were, and the kids were so new to England. They were born in Birmingham, these guys, but they had the accent of their parents. It was half Birmingham and half Punjabi, half Birmingham, half Irish, half Birmingham and half West Indian, and me, who was fully Birmingham at the time. But the point about it is, I feel so very, very sad at this sort of grievance style anti-racism as opposed to being against racism. And I mentioned Millwall because, of course, for years and years, their best player was their skipper, Danny Shittu, who was their player of the year. Everyone was used to each other for a very, very long time. It's so sad.
Yes, that's a very important point. And in our own era, and I describe some of how this has happened in the book, people of roughly our age have been very poor at communicating to younger people the nature of the societies we grew up in. And as you say, that, I mean, there was racism in parts of society, sure, but it was not by any means this sort of entirely white and racist society that is now depicted. And it hasn't been for a very long time, if it ever was, in a country like Britain. You know, it's one of the oddities of so-called anti-racism that people lambast the societies most which are the least racist, because by the nature of it, if people were racist, they wouldn't care if you said they were racist. People in societies like Britain care about it because we're not. When I was growing up in Britain in the 80s, popular culture was very diverse, and not just in music or in football, but in almost everything. You know, the evening news on the BBC was read by a black woman. The evening news on ITV was read by a black man. The main children's entertainer was a black young black guy, and we didn't think anything of it. And then I went to school in London, to state schools first, and they were very diverse, and grew up with black friends in the playground from the beginning. We were dreaming of becoming, if we had not already become, a post-racial society. And then everything in the last 20 years has been slowly turned around, as I show in the book. And societies that were on the cusp, at least, of being post-racial instead became hyper-racialized. And the way that happened is very, very interesting, and historians will pore over it for a long time to come. But one of the reasons is that countries like Britain in particular imbibed a specific race war that was ongoing in America. And all of the Western countries followed suit. We basically took onto ourselves an element of the ongoing racial disputes going on in the United States, so that, you know, in the last decade, the BLM movement, for instance, which there's a debate about its utility in the US. There's certainly a debate about what it's done with its the goodwill it had. But it does not have a viability in the UK. But of course, we had BLM protests in the UK, where people just transplanted this American culture war straight onto the streets of British cities. And that's been a constant in recent years. To say the sort of embedding of a specific American dispute, which has ended up just washing across particularly the English-speaking Western democracies, because we are so vulnerable to all American cultural exports.
It's extremely sad, and to this day, the knee is taken at football matches, and the Premier League's decided to wash their hands of any responsibility.
I mean,
by telling
why?
The players.
I mean, why? What do they think they're doing at this stage? I mean, we don't have. It would be odd if we had 2 minutes silence at the beginning of every game to remember British servicemen killed in the last 20 years. It would be more justifiable, much more justifiable, but people would probably say, okay, we've done that a few times. We don't need to keep doing it. Why do they keep taking the knee? Why do they keep doing it? They can't stop. The arrest and killing of George Floyd was appalling. The man responsible for it has been tried and convicted and sentenced in an American court. End of the matter as far as taking the knee goes. But they just can't stop. I think they think at this stage that if they do stop, they will be racist or accused of racism. It's pathetic.
Very true. And it continues now in the hands of the players. And of course, there'll be no player that stops it, because they'll feel it's above their pay grade, and their pay grades are quite big. I'm
absolutely. Well, it's the great combination of being overpaid and needing to over signal about things. They go hand in hand. That's why Hollywood celebrities and others also are the least adept at weaving through the intricacies of our age, because the costs of slipping up even slightly are so high, whereas the accruing of money for literally bending the knee to whatever the current thing is easy to do.
You go into some detail of what you call the anti-Western frenzy of the Durban Conference, and it's fascinating to read your take based upon the editorial parameters of your book, The War of the West, as I did in terms of the editorial parameters of my podcast, Jonny Gould's Jewish State, which, as we know, started in the days directly after 9/11. It's something that we've covered in detail. And in fact, it inspired the formation of Professor Gerald Steinberg's brilliant NGO Monitor.
Yes, which I'm on the advisory board of.
Wonderful. Well, of course, it is this Durban Conference, and there have been a number through the decades since. This is where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism were kind of created, this new anti-Israel narrative. And it's where your book very succinctly talks about the anti-Western sentiment.
Yes.
And this is where this intersection collides, doesn't it? It was very interesting to read the Western analysis of that very same conference, which Jewish people who are Zionists, which is the vast majority of Jewish people, have been fighting actually ever since.
Yes. The Durban Conference happened in the days before 9/11, and because of 9/11, some people forgot about it, and it's sort of and it got almost washed into the mainstream. But it was an orgy of anti-Westernism as well as anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. All of these things were tied up with each other. Anti-colonialism, you might add, as well, because all of these things got gathered together. You know, various dictators and despots, people like Castro, Mugabe, flotsam and jetsam of the Cold War and of the post-colonial world, all turned up and lambasted Israel, lambasted the West, called for reparations, called Zionism racism, and much more. And they just, it was just an orgy of anti-Westernism primarily. Anti-Semitism came along as a very, very important component of it. But essentially, it was a conference of revenge. I quote Nietzsche at one point in The War on the West saying, the people who talk of justice but mean revenge. Durban was about revenge, and the successive iterations of Durban have all been the same thing. There are attempts by bits of the developing world to have an act of vengeance taken out against the developed world. Post-colonial societies, which have gone well, by the way, never indulge in this. You won't hear calls for reparations in Singapore because Singapore's done well. You heard at Durban and elsewhere calls for reparations from, for instance, Robert Mugabe, because, as Mark Stein joked at the time, there were some African leaders who thought it would be useful to sort of persuade the white Westerners to send money to their country, and others like Mugabe who would have thought it was a bit more convenient if you just sent it direct to their Geneva-based bank accounts. But that was basically what it was. It was a shakedown, an attempted shakedown. And unfortunately, and I'm hoping that my book helps to change this, there's been too much in recent decades of people in the West just sort of kowtowing to these demands. There's been a sort of unwillingness to stand up to them. And I think it's high time people did stand up to them and said, sorry, we're not doing games of historical iniquity. We're not doing games of historical revenge. We're not having games of historical guilt. If you want to pretend that people born as I was in the post-colonial period in Britain are meant to carry some guilt, no, I don't, we don't. It's over, it's done with, it's in the past. We paid down our debt. We paid down our debt with slavery in the UK, more than paid down our debt through the 19th century. And when people come along now and say, you never addressed this, my answer is, you don't know we've addressed it many times. It's just you're ignorant. You don't know that fact because you haven't bothered to inform yourself of that fact. But this is done. This is settled. And we are moving on, even if you are not.
Why isn't there such a bigger counter-argument? Why are fair-minded people being trounced so much within the institutions, within these corporations, within
those
the
are
NHS, wherever you go,
different
silent majority, we're okay, are we?
So look, the majorities are fine. The majorities are fine. I think they should stop being silent. I think one of the things about majorities is it's idiotic for a majority to be silent. It might be understandable why a vast, an incredible minuscule minority might be silent, but why would a majority be silent? It's inexplicable in some ways. But the explanation is the second thing you mentioned, which of course is institutions. Now that is certainly the case. within government institutions, state institutions, private corporations, companies, and much more. There is an extraordinary tentativeness, a fear. And of course, there's an explanation for that, which is that the sort of anti-Westernists are, like other dogmatists of our time, extremely vicious. And a lot of people, if they said even a fraction of what I said or say in certain companies or positions, would have a mob come after them, online or offline. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cowardice from people in positions of power. They've stopped making their own side in an argument. A lot of them want an easy life. It's easier to hand people over to the mob, as everybody knows, than it is to stand up to the mob. But that has to change. It simply has to change. It is unsustainable that, for instance, the civil service in Britain should be put through things like implicit bias training and all of this sort of crock stuff, which is all voodoo. It doesn't work. It can't even do what it pretends to do. There's no reason why the civil service should be doing that on the taxpayer dime. There's no reason why heads of major institutions like universities should be instituting, for instance, investigations as to whether or not they gained from the slave trade. Why? Why do that now? Why do that now? The answer is almost certainly going to be yes to some extent. So what are you going to do about it? You probably gained from donations given by people who weren't democratic politicians. I mean, most of our institutions a lot of our major institutions in the UK were founded by monarchs, by noble families. Where did their money come from? Was it entirely fairly earned? Possibly not. Okay, so where are you going to stop? The people who lead these institutions and give these stupid directives to sort of cover themselves in some kind of post facto glory are in actual fact putting bombs under their institutions that will blow them apart. So unfortunately, the answer is yes, the majority is I think, fine. I think the weirdo fringe people are the people who I attack in the book. They just have an unbelievably disproportionately prominent voice in the public discourse. Well, I think that should end, and I think it can.
I was on TV on Saturday night, and I was very, very privileged to have Kelly J Keane in the studio with me.
Oh yeah,
very
much admire her.
Yes, and I got to ask her all the right questions, and she defined absolutely every part of her position on trans, which is one part of the intersectional debate which I'm not quite as up on as others. And my question to her was, why don't we stand by our beds? Why don't we stand by who we are? If we remember who we are, if our first base is Christianity, or in my case, Judaism, or I don't know, just being British or being American, being Canadian, these are the things that I was brought up in at school. This is what I believe in. These things are easier to fight back with. So, for example, church attendance in Britain has halved in 40 years. Yeah. Why is the church surrendering and therefore creating a vacuum in which it is being swirled around in? I'm delighted to say that in Britain, the biggest 10 Jewish communities of Orthodox synagogues, those of the Beth Din, are actually increasing in size, despite what the doom and gloom around the country of the Jewish community assimilating. There's some good news in London, at least, in certain parts, but it's not such good news in the Church of England, if you are someone who classes themselves as a C of E.
Yes, well, the answer is, and I dealt with some of this in The Madness of Crowds, but the answer is that basically one religion is being replaced by another, and the religion is the religion of social justice and intersectionalism and much more. And it has its own dogmas, and it has actually overtaken, among other things, I mentioned this in The War on the West, it has, among other things, overtaken the Church of England with extraordinary rapidity. I mean, it's only 15 years ago, less, that Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, was opposed to any form of gay marriage, not just that blessed by the church, which is the church's business. Nobody should force it to bless unions it doesn't want to bless. But it was also opposed to state union, civil marriage. And by contrast, earlier this year, Rowan Williams was one of a group of signatories who said of trans people that trans people are, I can't remember the exact quote, it was something like on the way to a greater union with God. Very strange. Very strange. Is this because he's no longer Archbishop of Canterbury and he can speak his mind more freely? Or has his own thinking evolved? Or is it possible that Rowan Williams, like so many other people, has decided to give up the old faith and jump with both boots on into the new one, which is all about ridiculously minor issues like trans issues, which are important for a tiny number of people, but have a totally disproportionate significance in the national debate and conversation. In recent years, Church of England has thrown itself into the religion of anti-racism. I wish I could always put anti-racism in quotation marks, because of course the new anti-racism is simply racism in a different guise. But when the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, stands before the General Synod 2 years ago and says the Church of England is institutionally racist, apart from rolling our eyes and saying, gosh, to keep repeating such a banal and meaningless phrase is quite something, even for a cleric. But to say that, for instance, racism is whispered in our pews, as one of the Church of England's official reports into this. No, it's not. No, it's not. That's a total lie. It's not.
It's a terrible thing to say about your community as well, isn't it?
Yes. And here's the thing, Johnny. You see, I was brought up in Anglican. I know the Anglican Church very well, or pretty well. Here's the thing. If you didn't know it at all, you would probably take it by its own estimation. If you were, for instance, a young black Londoner in the 2020s, if the Church of England said it's a racist institution where everyone's whispering racism in the pews, you'd probably believe it and keep away, among other things. Because why would you join something that seems to be claiming to be the KKK at prayer? Why would you bother? The answer is they're lying about themselves. I mean, they're lying about themselves because they want to be part of the new religion of so-called anti-racism. And by the way, I mean, it's astonishing, as I say in The War on the West, the Christian tradition has a very good, long, noble, male and female tradition of, for instance, anti-slavery and anti-racism. I mean, it has a lot of heroes going back centuries and centuries who were opposed to slavery. It has heroes for centuries who were anti-racist. Indeed, of course, as we know, not only in the late 18th and early 19th century, but right up to the period of apartheid in South Africa, it was church leaders who were leading much of the anti-apartheid movement. And a bewildering array of races were involved. The Anglican Communion today around the world, as I've seen myself on travels in Africa, does not lack for Black adherents or worshippers. When Justin Welby pronounced the national church to be the established church to be institutionally racist, his number two was the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu. What are these people? What are they doing? They're giving up their own tradition in order to join an extraordinarily facile, highly politicized, ideologically deranged movement invented a few years ago.
I want to ask you what you think the future is for Jewish people in the Western world, that justice and, shall we say, multi-ethnicity and tolerance suddenly seems to be shifting east. I think of the Expo in Seville in 1992, and I think, well, that's in Dubai now, where Jewish people, Israelis, can wear a kippah in Dubai. It's a bit more difficult to put one on in Hove these days. In Brighton, it is, with Palestinian protests going on Saturday afternoon. But it's not just about Jewish people, this podcast. It's about all minorities, about Sikh people and Hindus, and actually perhaps something positive to say here, that actually our pure multi-ethnicity, if you talk to the array of different immigrants that have come to this country and done quite well on the quiet, because it's never the successful people that make a great deal of noise, that actually the hope that our increased multi-ethnicity and our tolerance in this post-racial society might just save us from this mob.
Well, Jews always get caught up first in any bad revolution, don't they? Or any revolution. I mean, I'm a great fan of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, and in the middle of that stupendous work, it's quite about the darkest hours of the 20th century. It is quite extraordinary that Grossman takes time out just in a few pages right at the heart of the novel to look into the question of anti-Semitism, and to explain, as he does, that the terrifying nature of anti-Semitism is the way in which it shapeshifts. It goes from right to left. It goes again. It can attack Jews for being too well off and for being too poor. It can attack them for being too assimilated and for not trying to assimilate. Gregor von Redstory obviously makes some of the same points in his work. But, Jews will get it from every direction, and as I always say, anyone who says, as occasionally various Labour politicians trying to put Jeremy Corbyn into power would say, they would say things like, we are certainly going to stamp out anti-Semitism. We're going to end anti-Semitism. They'd make these sorts of claims. And I would always say, anyone who says such a thing must know nothing about anti-Semitism. I mean, you must know nothing about it if you could make such a facile statement. End anti-Semitism? I don't think so. It is far too perennial and entrenched. You can keep it down, but you'll never destroy it once and for all. And we see that in the modern era. We see it obviously in the case of Israel. Jews were attacked for being rootless cosmopolitans, and then were attacked for having a state. They were attacked for being incapable of defending themselves, and then were attacked by the world for successfully defending themselves. On and on it goes, and on it will always tragically go. But yes, in the current era, I'm very struck by the way in which Jews get caught up in the anti-Westernism of our day, in Israel and in the rest of the West. I think that people have to realize this. They have to have good antennae. It can come from the right as well as the left, and I've myself written about this again recently. There are bits of the right in America, not so much I think in the UK, if at all at the moment, but you always have to keep your eyes open. There are bits of the right in America which play with anti-Semitism in the same ways that parts of the left do. So it can come from any direction. And Jews very often get caught up in almost anything. The Occupy Wall Street movement goes to anti-Semitism. BLM goes to anti-Semitism. We just have to keep our antennae very alert. Jews and non-Jews, Jews and I don't like philo-Semites because I don't believe in philo-Semitism. Just friends of Jews, people who are friends of the Jewish people. We all have to keep our eyes open for this, and again, and to not make it a political issue. It should not be a right-left thing or anything else, but to have an awareness of problems like this. And there is something important to be said in this as well, which is to stress that Jewish people have the option of a homeland in Israel. Not all want to do that, of course. The diaspora is very strong and very deep and goes back a long way in many, many countries. But I think it is important also that people recognize that other peoples also have a desire for statehood and nationhood, and have the right to celebrate their own traditions. And, to that extent, lots of people have their own covenants, effectively. Jewish people have theirs, Jewish British people have theirs, non-Jewish British people have theirs, and much more. And if we can see a way to respect each other across those divides, and I think we can, then we should do so, and should unite against the people who would use a minority as effectively a battering ram against society. I'm very confident that there is a good enough alliance of good people of all faiths who can push back against the madnesses of our time, and that the war on the West is just one of the madnesses of our time, perhaps the most serious and underlying one, but one which all of us who believe we've benefited from being in the West can unite in pushing back against. And I think we'll win. I've seen unwinnable wars in my life, but this is a winnable one.
Well, I certainly hope so. You give us a lot of courage for those of us who perhaps should speak out. I said it myself in a recent speech I made to the synagogue. They asked how they could win the battle. And I said, well, it's not just the platform for me, and I'm lucky to have radio and television and my podcast to do so, but you in the workplace, wherever you are, you can be
Yes.
the change. You can
That's
actually
right.
make that difference. Everyone is a sort of media property. Everyone has their Facebook. Everyone can
Absolutely.
talk amongst their community. We can get out of the echo chamber. And The
Absolutely.
War on the West is a fantastic book. And I must say, Douglas, I am really grateful for your time today. Thank you so much
Oh,
for joining me on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
well, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, and to all of your viewers and listeners.